For many people, the word tarot conjures up images of fortune tellers in dark, mysterious rooms. What they may not imagine is our guest today. Dr. Andy Morgan is a psychiatrist, a professor, an artist, performer, magician, and expert at tarot. He not only uses the tarot as a tool for self-reflection, he gives tarot card readings and performs live shows about the tarot. He's created a remarkable new tarot deck called the Tarot Spiritist Mundi, and has written a companion book that reimagines the tarot as a tool for reflection, creativity, and freedom. I am delighted to be talking today with my friend, Dr. Andy Morgan. How you doing, Andy?
I'm really well, Michael. Thanks for calling.
So, Andy, you are such an interesting mix of talents. I have to know, how did you first become interested in tarot?
Oh, well, way back, I actually had a family member who did read cards, my grandmother, and she did read cards, but not tarot. She sort of used regular cards for card readings, and then sort of I belonged to a church that forbid cards, tea, coffee, and alcohol, and all that. So I didn't pay any attention to them for years, and it was later in my mid-20s when I was performing magic. I got refascinated again by the tarot. And then much more recently, in the last 10 years, I sort of reawakened my interest. And certainly during the pandemic, it was a lot of time to say, let me get back into it, restudy the cards, reimagine them. And that's how I got the idea of recreating a deck.
So, before we talk about your deck, I'm interested in knowing how you use tarot sort of in your life.
Well, for me, tarot is very, very much like art, or self-exploration, like doing art therapy, doing drawing, any about meditation, relaxation. For me, it was never relaxing if I wanted to take time and do some drawing. It was never relaxing to have an idea in my head about what I might draw or what I set out to draw. That always traveled with too much concern about, will it turn out right? Will it look like I wanted to? And things like that. So I was a fan of like automatic drawings where I scribble all over a page and then turn it around and around and find imagery to let that image sort of surface. And I experienced the tarot in very much the same way, where I like to see what the images themselves suggest and a narrative emerges that I haven't considered before. So it's very much like play. I think of it a lot like play therapy, playing in a sandbox, playing with art, and really being open to serendipity, sort of pleasant surprises of combinations of images and messages that surface, and then using those as a way of reflecting on something that I hadn't possibly considered before. I think, like I tell many people, humans we're kind of funny. We always tend to see what we already believe, and we tend to pay attention to what we're already looking for. And I think what I really enjoy about those kinds of exercises in art, and especially when reading the tarot, is that I'm pleasantly surprised, because very often it pushes us to think about something in a slightly different way than we would have wanted to.
Interesting. So you really use the tarot for self-reflection, for sort of meditation?
I do. All during COVID, it was a great way to start the day. I made a cup of coffee, sit in a chair, lay out cards, reflect on them, and then simply do a creative writing piece about it. And I would send it off to my friend Enriquez, and then later in the day, he'd send me a note back reflecting on my reflection about the same three cards. I'd send him the picture of the three cards I'd reflected on, and we had this ongoing dialogue and conversation over the course of at least a year. But it was really unusual, because suddenly you discover how people see things differently, and it opens your eyes to different interpretations of the cards, different possibilities. And I found that sort of mind expanding and relaxing at the same time.
So you've created this pretty amazing deck called the Tarot Spiritus Mundi, and what I love about your approach is it's completely different from what most people expect of a tarot deck. Instead of fortune telling, you've really sort of made this deck alive and sort of blended something that feels very much a part of art and psychology, and something sort of I don't know. It's something really sort of very different about this. So tell me, what inspired you to create your own tarot deck?
Wow. So I'd been performing a show prior to the pandemic called The Woman Who Saw All, in which I refer to tarot. It's written about my grandmother, and I was using a tarot deck. And I used to say to my friends who are artists, I'd really like something unique for the show. Would you design a tarot deck for me? And they'd all said, no, there's 78 cards. I'm not doing it. And so I thought, oh, well, I guess that's not going to happen. I just won't have anything special to use in a show other than a deck that people are familiar with. And as I said, during the pandemic, I would draw every day, do a meditation every day. And one day, as I was drawing, I suddenly saw an image. It was actually shortly after a friend of mine who had passed during COVID from uterine cancer. And I looked at the image, and in my deck, it's the death card. It was the first image. And when I drew that, I remember looking at it and thinking, that that really would be a cool card representing death, loss, passing in a tarot deck. And I said, that's kind of neat. Maybe a more monochrome tarot, sort of in sort of a soft beige and black. Um, and the idea was in my head. And then I think a couple of days later, the card that came next was Strength. And I thought, well, I might be onto something here. This just seems to be emerging while I'm drawing other kinds of drawings. And over the course of about 2 months, I suddenly had all but two of the major arcana. And then, of course, I panicked because the other two didn't arrive. I think it was missing Judgment and the Chariot. And I remember sitting down trying to draw them. It had no flow. It didn't feel relaxed. It didn't feel anything like the other drawings. And I thought, well, that's it. I guess I don't get a set of tarot. And then, like a month later, I was relaxed and talking to some friends, and I was doodling while we were talking. And suddenly, there was the Chariot. And then finally, Judgment came along. Uh, and as you said, my cards are slightly different than other people's. I mean, I think if you know tarot, I'd like to think people can recognize sort of some of the coding in the card and recognize what the cards are, but they're very solitary. Maybe it was a side effect, during the pandemic and a lockdown, but there's only really two cards that have more than one figure in them, and that would be the Wheel of Fortune and the World in my
Mm.
sets. So I think of them as individual characters, and there's a real freedom in your imagination to play with them because there's not much else there. They're engaged in an activity, they have a look, and I think for me, they're really evocative. They can flip in their meaning back and forth, in the tone and the mood, depending on the moment. And I think for me, that made reading cards much more fun. I think there's some cards when I look at them, they're beautiful, but they seem very fixed in their meaning. When I look at a card, it seems to be telegraphing to me, this is what you must conclude when you look at this card. Sort of, it's like a
Mm.
sign, almost like a stop sign says stop, right? Um, and I'd like to think that my cards are much more like symbols, that they hold multiple meanings at once. And so you can flip it. For example, when you look at Strength, one day when you look at her, it looks like she's leaping away, but another day it looks like she's leaping in. And that's entirely in the spur of the moment. When I pair her with another card, she may be leaping away, leaping in, which is then how I came to think of cards as more like nouns, verbs, adjectives, so that when I line them up and string them together, uh, they speak on their own. They kind of form a narrative structure, so to speak. Um, but yeah, that was
Interesting.
part of my dissatisfaction with some of the cards, is they seem too rigid, and these things just felt more playful.
Yeah, I think you said in the book that you thought the traditional Rider Waite felt very still or formal to you. And
Yeah.
I, I do have to admit that these cards do have a very different feel. They don't feel like that at all. They feel very personal and very sort of first person,
Oh,
which
thank
I
you.
find kind of refreshing. Why did you call it the Spiritus Mundi? What does that mean to you?
That's sort of the spirit of the world, sort of the spirit world, or the animus of the world. I think I was probably listening to the Police Synchronicity album at the time, and heard stinging Spiritus Mundi, in Synchronicity, and it clicked because I think for me, it's a bit like synchronicity or serendipity, if you will. I think they're both the same. I think serendipity is that spontaneous, joyful surprise sort of thing, just sort of a meaningful coincidence of you throw down cards and they suddenly reflect exactly what's going on in your mind or in your life. And I think it just clicked in that moment, sort of like the kind of the spirit of the world at the moment there during the pandemic. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, the cards are unique and beautiful. I mean, certainly you can tell that they sort of began as an automatic writing scribbles and turned into these sort of great images. Who who do you think that this deck is for?
I'd like to think that the deck has a very broad application. I'd like to think that people who have no familiarity at all with the tarot could approach the cards and be playful with them. I think I've really noticed, like when I do psychic cocktail events, that many people they hear the word tarot and they either bristle, they're quite nervous, like, oh my god, I might get like the devil, the death card, or the tower. They bring with them some sorts of anxieties or fears about the cards, and that it produces a distance between them and the cards. And like to say, cards are us. So I'd like to think that people, when they're playful and they can engage with the card, their cards become suddenly both much more meaningful and surprising. They become actually, for me, much more magical, because you're like, oh, wow. Like, so people often say is, how did that happen? It's exactly what's going on in my life at the time. So I'd like to think that the cards are for people who have no experience with tarot, and that they're a little bit of a playful way of engaging with cards. And then I think for people who are familiar with tarot, it's my sort of offer to them to say, I think these cards challenge you in a reading in a slightly different way. I think that if people are used to reading cards that seem to have an arbitrary value and message to them, my cards, I would hope, would push the reader to relax a little bit and let the cards in the moment um, take on the life of their own, which I think, when I think about sort of the really magical things that have happened during readings, I think that when you let the cards speak on their own, it becomes altogether more surprising for people and magical in the moment, more than it would if I just stuck to a traditional meaning of a card. And we often say things, and like I say, like serendipity or synchronicity, people are just shocked and amazed at how specific the reading is about what's going on for them at the time.
So you created this entire deck of 72 tarot cards and a
78.
companion.
Yep.
I'm sorry, 78 tarot cards and a companion book to go along with it that describes the cards and I think teaches people how to sort of give themselves and other people readings.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping people enjoy it, right? There's so many books on the market where you just look up, here's a card, here's a meaning. And when I thought about writing a book, I thought, well, I don't really want to do that, because I think it's been really well done by so many people. Why would people need yet another book on here's the meaning of this card, right? So I thought it might be more interesting to write a book after introducing, okay, so here are my cards, because they don't all have labels on them in the majors. So the first part of my book does introduce people to the card and say, these are the traditional ideas that are sort of that swirl around this card and its imagery. But then the rest of the book is devoted to how to read cards. And I share, hopefully well, with people this idea of how to begin to you with reading cards. Like, start with one, add another one, and look at how that card may modify it, and how its meaning change. If I add a third card, what is the meaning now of the combination of the three? And then I love doing a 6 card spread, like 2, 2, and 2. So I walk people through it with a series of exercises. And then I include in the book a string of questions that are real questions from real readings and real answers that I gave people at the time with the reading that's there. And then I give a few that are sort of like, okay, now you try. And I list out the cards and I give the reader a chance to reflect on and say, how would you read these? And then you can see what meaning came to me at the moment. And if it's the one that you get, great. If it's not, let it go and go with the meaning in the moment that you created, which I think is the more playful way to do it. But that was my goal in writing the book, was to give people a little more hands-on practice at reading cards, because at the end of the day, you just have to get out and do it, right? If people say, I'd love to read cards, um, the most magical things happen, to my way of thinking, when you read cards for another person and see the delight, the surprise, the magic that happens. I have a particular quirk. I don't ask people their question when I read cards. I tell them to frame a question that's meaningful to them, that they don't know the answer to, but they would like to have some insight about, and it's private. It should be kept only in their head while they mix the cards. And then I tell them, I'll tell you what I see in the cards, and you'll tell me what makes sense. And it's surprising to do it that way. It's sort of scary in one sense, right? Because you'd think, well, if they tell me the question, I can create a narrative. But I find it lovely, more challenging, more magical when I tell them, this is what I see, and this is the narrative. Not knowing your question, this appears to be what the cards would be saying. Now, if your question was related to work, the narrative would be tweaked slightly in this way, and I read the cards again. And I say, but if your question was personal, and you don't have to tell me, this is how it would be more specifically sort of tailored to a personal relationship sort of setting. And then I sit back and I say, that makes sense. And usually people are just silent and nod, and they go, yes. And some people are quite perplexed because they've never told you the question, which I love, because then you can say, it was a private thing just for you. You never have to share your question with me if you don't want to. Some people are just dying to tell you the question at the end. And then if they do, you can say, oh, well, with that, would you like to extend the reading even more? Other people are absolutely content to go away meditating over this really magical thing that has occurred in our interaction and in their mind. And I do think that part of it's because it's private. They keep a question in their head, and I think part of it's due to the cards themselves, that they have a freedom to really sort of stir things up in a person's mind and brain, and then they link to one another in a conversational sort of way, more than I personally feel like some other cards do. But yeah,
So I understand. I know that you do you have a 6 card spread that you like to do generally. Tell
I
me about
do.
that.
There's well, what's really behind it is I always found the big Celtic cross wheel system interesting for readers, but convoluted for the people you're doing card readings for. It just seemed to me to be too much in doing a reading for people that they could get their head around. And I settled on a 2 card reading. I had morphed something I'd seen from a colleague named Max Maven, who did 6 card readings.
Hmm.
And he always had this philosophy, like, clarity and simplicity makes sense to people. You give them something they can focus on, and they can track it, and they can appreciate it. They're not left wondering, what was I supposed to be doing? What was I supposed to be thinking? What does this mean? What does this mean?
Right.
And I took that advice, and I decided I would lay out cards in a particular way. So I pulled out 2 pair, put 2 cards. In the first pair, I treat very much like you would at the beginning of sort of a Celtic circle and cross formation, is that these are the 2 themes that are slightly at odds or not in alignment with one another, and that these 2 themes underpin the person's question. They're not the person's question, but they are the 2 themes that are giving rise to the question. Then the second pair I lay out, and I will say, this pair explains why you haven't come to a conclusion yet. You haven't resolved your question. You haven't arrived at insight about it. But this one tells you why you're stuck, why this is being perpetuated. And the third pair is the way forward. It's the recommendation. It's the next actionable step. Like, Luke Germain would say, it's the next action. It's the step you should take next. But I like it because I call it the recommendation. So I identify, here's the issue that's underpinning your question. Here's why you haven't been able to resolve this. And the way forward, according to the Tarot, would be the meaning of these two cards as they're aligned, and then I interpret that rather specifically. And I find in that three-step, um, there's a clarity of it for the person I'm reading for, and then they can walk through it and they go, oh, these are the themes. This is why I'm stuck. This is what I need to do.
Right.
And so it's all very much in the present and looking forward to the future. So I find it more meaningful than just doing three cards, your past, your present, and the future. I think with my cards, since they're solitary, they look like they're speaking to one another, that pairing them, you get these multiple themes, and it's like a bigger sentence for me when I read it across for
I
that.
did like your conflict, cause, and prescription way of doing readings, but you also talk about the cards as nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And I think that's what you're getting at now with the
Yeah.
pairs of cards. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. When I look at a card, I really, one strikes me as the main action, and the other one's modifying it. And most of the time, you say, hey, the first card is, I see it as the theme, and the one that adds on modifies its meaning either. Um, but sometimes they flip right in the moment. You go, oh God, this one's modifying that one. But traditionally, I'll lay it down, and the next card either becomes an adjective or an adverb, um, or something modifying the first. And I find that I don't do that necessarily when I'm reading like with a Tarot de Marseille deck or something, but I'm reading with mine. I find with my deck, it lends itself very, very easily in my mind to that noun, verb, adjective, and adverb sort of arrangement with it. So I like that. Um, yeah, and I don't know how that evolved. I didn't have anybody teach me that in reading cards. I think as I was reading it, the overarching idea is, what's the narrative, like what's going on here, and then it just began to strike me with the more solitary imagery. The cards lent themselves very well to saying, well, this is like an adjective, this is boosting this, or this is an adverb modifying the activity that's going on in the other card, rather than enhancing the description of the nature, the quality of the action, or something like that. But yeah, I
Mhm.
encourage people to play with it that way. And I think it makes readings less intimidating. It lets you try out a narrative. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's the beauty of symbolism, is that a card can hold two meanings or three meanings at once. And you can try out two different lines of ideas and say, one of those makes the most sense to you. And people go, yes, and then you go with that, and then that builds that has a downstream effect then on the next layer and the next layer.
So
Uh,
you're in your deck, you've really sort of distilled the traditional historic meaning of a card down into a single, almost a single idea, a single that could very well be described as a single word or an idea. And it does make it easy for you to sort of form sentences with cards, which is kind of
yes,
interesting and kind of freeing, and it does simplify it when you're giving a reading and looking at the meanings of the cards and how they interact to sort of give you ideas of what the two sort of mean together. It is it's they're great. I'd like to actually like look at some of these cards and talk about that a little bit,
yeah,
just to show people what the cards are like. You mentioned that the first card that you completed was the death card. Yeah, how
yes.
does and you mentioned that you did automatic drawing initially, or scribbling, and out of the scribble sort of emerged this particular card. Can you tell us a little bit about this card and how it sort of set the philosophical tone for the rest of the deck?
Yeah. So when you have a look at the card, there's a figure. Its hand is over its heart, but there's a giant black space, which you could perceive either as a hole or something as being opaque. But the whole posture is one that struck me right away as being of sad. And when we think of the death card in sort of the tradition, it's kind of like the harvest, the turnover. In some cards, there's like beheaded people being raked over by a skeleton and a sigh. Um, and so it has these imagery that are associated. Some people will associate it with like the Day of the Dead, or with the harvest, or with the end of the world. It's like the Grim Reaper. And for me, the Death card, as I look at those meanings historically in the card, a couple of ideas that kept circling around is that something's changing and turning over, but you have to give up something. So for me, the death card became of what do you hang on to and what do you let go of, and that it's not without an emotional price. That it's always sad to let go of something that we've cared about or that we've held on to for security or that we've cherished. But life's like that; it moves forward. So for me, in this figure, there is a sadness to the card, but it's not angst. The character isn't agitated, and the hand over the heart just struck me as saying sometimes you're not really sure what it is you need to let go of. Right? It's kind of opaque at times on what's been holding us back, what would let us go forward, and so the death card is about change, and change is, in my mind, always connected to what I hang on to and what I let go of. I think that part of that is part of the human dilemma, that we attach, but we need to explore and keep growing. And growth always means there may be a departure from where we were. So for me, that the death card holds a lot of that imagery without looking violent and scary to
Yeah.
people. Although the emotion is still quite alarming to people, right? Like, I have to let go of something that's been very, very dear to me, right? So,
Yeah.
but the imagery isn't scary.
Yeah, but yeah, people who get the death card though, the traditional imagery is sort of scary and upsetting to people. So I think
Oh,
this is
yeah.
a very refreshing approach at it. Whenever I look at a new tarot deck and am evaluating it, I immediately like go to a very few specific cards that I know well to see how they approach it, and the death card is one of them. The other one, very quickly, is the Fool. I always want to see how this artist is doing a Fool. Hey, tell me about your Fool.
Well, my fool, as you know, these things like emerge on paper, and my fool is a character who looks sort of peacefully, totally absorbed in examining some sort of flower or tulip, but absolutely lost in sort of the enjoyment of what he's doing, um, to such an extent that he doesn't notice this giant fish with jaws coming up to bite him in the ankle or something. And that always reminded me of the traditional imagery of the fool who's, in the Rider Waite, he's walking out there into the big wide world, and he might walk right off the cliff because he's so enamored by the great view. In the Tarot de Marseille and older versions, you see the fool walking along and his pants are down, and there's an animal that's either going to scratch his ass or his balls or something, where he seems clueless and oblivious because his mind is elsewhere. So for in this deck, my fool represents, to me, really spoke to me as saying he's absolutely lost and absorbed in something really quite wonderful, to the character. And there's a beautiful thing about that, right? When we can get lost in something, we can play. We can be lost in music, lost in a book. You can leave all your other cares behind when you're absolutely absorbed. And so the card for me flips between him being absolutely lost and absorbed, or you can say there is a side effect to being totally lost and absorbed, is that you might be clueless about something that might not be helpful that could occur to you while you're doing it. So, uh, that's how that card evolved. And but for me, that's the imagery. It's what can we get absorbed in, and what can control our total focus and attention in in a playful, positive, engaging way. It's not in an obsessive sort of way. That's handled with a different card. But this one is about that absolute delight. It's just like a baby being enamored by mama's face, right? It's just, it's just absolutely locked in. The world is that flower at the time.
If you had to distill it down to one word or phrase, what would it be?
Oh, I would say for the fool, I think of just joyful absorption. You're
Absorption.
just, yeah, absorption.
So one of
Yeah.
the other big cards that I always look at when I look at a brand new tarot deck is, of course, the devil. And I have to
Yes.
say that your devil, I think, is my favorite of all time
Oh, thank
because
you.
it framed it in a way that I think is super useful. Your devil is this sort of smooth southern gentleman with a pocket watch with no hands. And it's all about sort of temptation. So,
Yeah.
what does this card say about temptation to you?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's sort of like when you think of why people fall for con men and things like that. The the thing that lures us always comes from inside. So the reason people fall for cons is usually there's greed, right? There's something I want to earn money when I really probably shouldn't earn it for my investment. So for me, the devil was really about what tempts us really comes from inside us.
Mhm.
um, and temptation can steal our attention. And that's I just saw him like playing with this pocket watch, and that's got his attention. That we can have our attention stolen by the new shiny penny thing, but it's usually linked to a desire that we have. And so I think for reflection, the the card for me becomes one that challenges the reader to say, what is it that's stealing my focus and my concentration, that's a temptation, that's coming either from a source of perhaps something kind of selfish that might not be that helpful, that's trapping me in some way because it's binding my attention, but it's coming from a real selfish, maybe an unhelpful, selfish sort of thing that could work to my detriment. And I think it's more useful in a reading than looking at danger in the outside world. It's saying
Yeah,
some of the stuff that causes us trouble is because we've been tempted and we have that secret desire of something we want, and it's holding us in that way. It's got our eye, and that's what's luring us away
yeah.
from maybe the path we ought to be on. And for me,
And
that made
I
more sense than two little demons chained to a devil. Yeah.
No, it does. I think that's what I find this so helpful is because it takes it from this sort of external sort of concept and makes it about compulsion or obsession,
Mm-hmm.
and which is something very tangible, very first person, something that people can very much relate to their current situation or with their question
Yeah.
very easily, as opposed to sort of these abstract concepts that people sort of talk about.
Yeah, in the reading, it definitely in a reading pushes you inside because it does push you for self reflection, saying, what is it that I'm doing that's playing an active role in this dilemma that I'm experiencing?
The other one I really like, hang on one sec, I'm going to pull it out. It was the Lover's card that you
Oh,
renamed as
oh yeah,
Choice.
the choice. Yeah, the lovers of the choice. Um, Here we go. It is
I
that one.
can't find it in my. There you go. So I found that fascinating that in your deck, the Lover's card has been renamed the Choice, and I didn't really know what the history of that was, or if that came from sort of any historical meaning from tarot, or where they came
Yeah.
from. But I liked it very much because again, it made the whole idea very tangible and very first
Mm.
person again, and something people could relate to. Can you show that card again? Since I don't have it.
Absolutely.
So this is your choice card. Can you tell me more about why you renamed it the choice and what that's about?
Yeah, I named it. So historically, the earliest tarot that we have are really from the 15th century, maybe around 1440. They're actually over here at the Beinecke at Yale, and the early depiction from the Visconti Sforza sort of family is a real marriage of sort of his daughter getting married. So it was about sort of the choice you make in marriage. But later, about a century later, There are some associations with the card. Actually, it doesn't even take a century. It's probably about 50 years later. There's an association with the card that's more about long-term decision making. Sort of, you're making a commitment over time for something, and that's how the choice sort of arose. Because in some of the cards, the young man appears to be trying to choose between two women, and people have debated, is one the mother-in-law, is one the mother, is one the wife, and it's this choice in life. People have read a lot onto the cards, but he does appear to be trying to make a choice between options. And I think for me, when I was drawing and thinking about it, I said, well, you know, without making the cards so gendered, because sort of those are certainly references to more traditional sort of marriage situations. I said the essence of the card is, how will we choose for something that's more of a long term commitment to something, someone, something, and it made more sense to go with the choice, because it's a reminder that we can make decisions that may have long-term consequences, whether we really evaluate that or not. In other words, choices bind us in a way. And I remember when I saw the figure that emerged, and it's this person curled up who appears to be kind of bound, um, almost like in a ball, but who's staring off into the dark. And there were a little pair of eyes over in the dark. I was thinking the thing that binds us when we're really super enamored by something, was we often lose sight of the long term impact of the choices we might make. And so in a reading, I found that using this concept with it is, we see something that catches our eye, we're passionate about it, and we make choices, and we're going to be held to those choices. There's going to be consequences to those choices over a long time. And that theme in a card says, are you aware? Have you been acting as if you are unaware of the long term consequences to a choice that you made, or the choice you're contemplating? Have you contemplated what comes next? And very often you can just see people suddenly start to grin and think about something, because in a moment when we're passionate about something, it's all right in the moment. When you, whether it's a person or an idea that we're infatuated about and that catches our eye, I think that would be great. And then sometimes what we miss is the idea, if I say yes or if I say no, it might be irreversible for a very long time. And so for me, in the readings, the card became much more useful than saying, okay, I see a romance, in your future. Like, well, yes, hopefully there's a romance. You're married, right? Or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was a term for the lovers card that I saw from late 15th, early 16th century when I was reading on Tarot. And I think for most of the cards, you alluded to this before, they really have studied the different cards, how the imagery has changed over time in the past, just as a way of trying to absorb, like a sponge, all the ideas that seem to have been attached to these different kinds of images across the centuries, and seeing, is there a common theme to those ideas? Because the tarot have been certainly appealing now for several hundred years now for people, and so I tried to distill it in my mind to say there seems to be a core set of ideas that seem to swirl around this card all the time. And so for me, the term, the choice, was a way of capturing what I thought was the essence of the majority of the ideas that surrounded it, between relationships, lovers, choosing who you're going to live with, who you should marry. And remember, at the time in 15th century, it wasn't all about romantic love. It was about putting families together and who has the dowry and who has the resources. So it made bigger sense to me. It made a larger sort of picture for me to expand it beyond the current notion of someone's in love.
Yeah, I love that. You also mentioned that like a lot of your cards have multiple directions that they can go, and I think one of the examples of that is the Hangman card, which I think is a lovely card of somebody who's sort of upside down. But as you always mentioned, that if you turn him over, he's
Oh,
very
it's like
much
he's dancing. Yeah.
it's a whole different ball game at that point, which I think is it's cool. The deck
Thank
has
you.
generally
Yeah,
been
that I remember when that card emerged, and and he oscillates. When you look at him, you say, "Well, he's upside down, but is he finally free of the tangled lines around him, or is he like in a bit of a spider's web, stuck on stuff, so he's not moving?" And those meanings oscillate back and forth for me. So in a reading, without knowing someone's question, when I look at that, I go, "Oh, the Hanged Man." I said, "This is a really interesting character because it's almost as if he like is he paused in an action or is he stuck? Would he rather be dancing?" But now he's upside down as if to get a different view, and then I settle on a meaning, but I mention the alternatives, and then depending on the card he's with, uh, the adjective or adverb component of pairing him with a card snaps the meaning in my head to one way or the other. That yeah, he's relatively stuck right now, or this says take a big pause. He's going. I think hanging out would be the best thing to do right now.
so you've done an entire tarot deck, all the cards. Your minor arcana cards, you say are symbols, not signs. Can you tell me
Correct.
what you mean by that?
So by a symbol, I mean a symbol is something that holds multiple meanings. A sign is usually something that tells us exactly either what we should do or what something means. And I like to think of the symbol as something that simply excites your mind to raise a bunch of possibilities. And
Mm.
then as you pair the cards, it begins to lock down some of those possibilities in that moment. Whereas a different day, you might string them along and see a slightly different trajectory to the moment. So with the pips or those minors, people say, "Well, look at two cups, or three swords," right? So people say, "Well, oh, let's go with swords." We say swords when we think of swords as being like wands, the things we do things with, right? It's not totally about relationships. So we think of swords of taking action. Some people think of aggression or conflict. I also think of like ruminating thoughts. So for me, when I look at this card and I see the spinning swords, I'm like, well, if it's an action that's spinning, is this an obsessing about I don't know how to take action. I can't grab the sword while it's spinning around, or am I busy tossing it around trying to figure out which course of action I'm going to take? So when I look at a card, I see it in motion. It's just the way my brain works. Whereas somebody else might look at it and they say, "There's three people holding swords. These swords, what are they doing?" If they do represent three people suddenly, they're not all in coordination with one another. Either, they're all kind of at different angles. But I tend to think of that as something's not settled. The course of action is not clear, it's churning. Whereas if I see the two cups you were holding up a moment ago, I'm like, well, it's so cute, right? Are they cuddling up together in this moment, or has one cup been knocked over, right? And in the moment, that may resonate with I've upset someone in a relationship, I've upset something in a relationship, or oh no, we're cuddling up real close. This relationship has said, it's not formal anymore. It's like scooting up together, and so that meaning flips back and forth for me when I'm doing a reading.
So I know all of your number cards in the minor arcana are all they don't have people in them, but your court cards do.
They
Um,
do.
which I find kind of fascinating. And I love that. Is this one of the queens?
That's you're
I,
holding a page. That's a
it's a page.
page. So all the pages in my deck, they're all
There it is.
reaching for their
There's a,
quality. So if it's a sword or a pentacle or a wand or a cup, the pages don't have it in their grasp. The queens, for some reason, I can't explain it. It just happened. They are all um, either throwing down their trait or holding it off. So as you can see, the Queen of Coin is dropping money, whatever that means for a moment. And the Queen of Wands is either holding it out there with the power of her mind or she's not taking it. Her hand is up, right? But queens do represent a person they're fully capable of exercising the quality of that suit, and they may be choosing not to. They'd be either choosing to take a specific action or not to implement that. Whereas the kings are totally in possession of what they've got and enjoying it thoroughly, right? For better or worse, they're in full possession. Like the King of Wands, he's almost stroking the wand. He's just like, it's like, I got this, right? Um, yeah. So in the deck, I didn't even know that until I laid all the cards out. I was doing an art show. It was down in New York, and the curator said, I'm putting all the cards up on the wall. And I laid them out, and I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, the queens are all dropping something. The kings are all hanging onto their thing, and they're faced in opposite directions. But that's what automatic drawing does. I had no realization of that at the time until I saw them all laid out. You could see the rhythm going across all the different cards. There is a there was a bit of a theme that evolved, like with the sixes. There's always three in the air and three aligned. Um, but other than that, I don't know. Um, I don't know of any other theme in the pips. They're like, in the tarot, more is better. If you have three wands and you go to four, four is more. Five is even more. And so I like that with that. I think for people who are used to reading more traditional cards that are in color, there are some systems that say, well, this card went from a warm color to a cool color. There's cooling off. In mine, there's not much color in them, so I think mine excite your mind through their activity and interaction
Okay.
more than with color change for that. And for me, that was just much. I love color, but it just made more sense for these not to have any color.
I find your cards very easy to use for sort of self-reflection. And you've said, I think in your book, that the tarot can be an antidote to our human tendency to be myopic or something.
Yes,
Can you
that's
tell me about
fancy.
that? Talk about
Sounding
that.
fancy. Yeah, we have a tendency, as I said, to look for information that confirms what we already think. People call that the confirmation bias, or myopia, getting a narrow view of things and not really looking around. And I think that, like, some people misunderstand the cards. They'll say, oh, well, you only see what you're looking for in cards. And I'm like, well, you can do that, but when you have a good reading and you're really open, sometimes the cards really suggest stuff you don't want to think about. And you
Mhm.
go, no, can't relate to it. And I think that that's the coolest way to look at cards and go, why didn't I want to see that meaning in the card? Why would I prefer this? Why would I prefer this narrative than that one?
Mm.
And you can challenge yourself and say, I'd rather that it said this, but it also appears to be saying that. And in that way, I think cards challenge us to break out of the mindset that's so easy for us all to get locked into. And I think in that way, they enhance your freedom and you know, the number of choices in your ability to make a different choice expands when you're not
Wow.
myopic. And so that's why I always say to people, I said, oh God, no, cards enhance your free will. They don't
Oh,
restrict it.
yeah.
People say, oh, card reading, it means you have no free will. Everything's predicted. And I went, no, that's not really how they work. I did a reading the other week in a psychic cocktail event. I had a young woman who looked a little bit disappointed right at the end because she was saying, yes, this all makes sense. And she said, but I do have a question. And she said, so they're not going to tell me what to do. And I said, you were looking for a yes or a no response. And she said, yeah, I kind of wanted them to tell me. And I said, oh, I'm glad you mentioned this because cards don't do that. The cards do tell you, here are the paths, but you're in the driver's seat. Here's the things to consider as you make the choice, yes or no. These are the alternatives. These are the things that go together. There are consequences to saying no. There's consequences to saying yes, but you do it with your eyes wide open. And she looked a little more disappointed for a moment. And I said, and when you think about it, I said, that's really what gives you freedom in life, right? No one tells you what to do. You get to own it, but you know why you're making a choice. And so you're doing it with your eyes open, and now you have more clarity, or you may choose to find another option, right? So I think that's really what I love about them, and it gets it away from, I would call it, the movie and TV land view of card reading, right? Like it's divination that just says you will do this, and that's never been that interesting to me. What's been more interesting, just like creativity in life, right, is something new, something
Mm.
brand new emerges out of this spontaneous arrangement of cards, and something new happens in front of the person in the moment, and they can create something new. And that's why I think it's like it's really magical. I have my neuroscience friends go, "Oh, how do you read cards? You're a neuroscientist." I went, "Yeah." And I remember I had a fellow. He came in for a reading at the pub the other night, and he's a neuroscientist, and he was just stunned. He goes, "But how do they do that?" I said, "What do you mean? How do they do it?" And he goes, "That's exactly what's going. I mean, how would it know that? Yeah, I didn't tell you my question. How would they do that?" And I went, "Yeah, that happens." And he said, "But how?" And I said, "So you just had a great dinner, right? Because it's a restaurant pub." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Did you sit back after the meal and go, why does this meal taste so good? Like, how did that happen?" And everything goes, "No, I just enjoyed it." I went, "There you go." We could dive into taste buds and, why does food taste so great? It never explains a meal. And in the same way with the cards, you're like, we're human beings, and divination readings have been around in many forms for thousands and thousands of years, and the tarot are a wonderful version of that. And I tell people, enjoy it. It's like, if you don't, you can go, "It's ink on paper," and you can wander away. But
I,
most
I
most people can't, right? After it's had a meaning, they go, how does that happen?" I'm like, "It's magic. It
I,
really is."
I really enjoyed sitting down and using the cards and giving myself readings. You're right. They speak to you in ways you don't expect, and they're always sort of instructive, which I think is pretty cool.
It is
How
funny at the end of a week, if you look back sometime, you go, "That's exactly what I had on Monday." Like it didn't make, and you look back in the week and you go, "That is right. That is what happened," right? And you go, "How?" And I just let it go and go, "Yeah, it's sort of serendipity. It's beautiful."
how do you think that people, tarot card readers who are used to a traditional tarot card deck, um, would adapt to using your deck or think of yours? Do you think is it a big mind shift between the two, or I don't know? Have you had feedback from people who know the
I
tarot
have
well?
gotten some feedback. Like I was down in New Orleans, and around the square where there's lots of readers, I remember carrying my bar cards. I call them my bar cards.
Yeah.
They're the ones where I'd originally had a printer, didn't know what he was doing, and I just had to pour coffee on them and anyway wear them in, right. And my experience when I showed them to other readers, they were fascinated. I mean, they were tender with the cards, and a couple of comments that came across right away is, one comment was, "Everyone is so young in the deck," because these
Oh,
aren't old figure. It hadn't occurred to me at all. And others went, they're so expressive, like I can, and they could play with them in a way. um, so I've never had anybody go, "Oh my god, I wouldn't know what to do with these." I
mm.
think that readers that I've talked to and I've shared my cards with have been really warm and receptive, and found them very easy, I think, to adapt to. A woman has that I know in England who reads, and she now uses them as her preferred reading deck. She said that her clients, when she gives them an option, they're fascinated by these individual figures more than they are by some of the traditional cards. And she said, "I just use these now as people can relate to them." And I said, "Oh, that's really kind." I mean, I think there's going to be some people who um, may not relate to them if they really like something that conveys to the person they're reading for that this is mysterious, kind of opaque, it's kind of mystical. Um, I think my cards don't look that mysterious. They're meant to be accessible. So I think for someone who uses a style of I'm distant, I'm like the oracle here, and you come to see me. They might like something that has more mysterious lettering on it, more symbols of the occult or something that might speak to people in a different way than my cards. Um, yeah, because mine, there are little symbols in mine that are, as people look closely, where they try and decipher what it might mean. But the cards aren't meant to be um, opaque in that way. They're, they were just me relating to them right away. So I'd like to think people can relate to them. My experience with readers has been that they've enjoyed them. Early on, when I would do readings like in the park, when we do the fundraising events, I didn't know. Well, would people want readings with my cards or the Tarot de Marseille or something? And I would put both decks out. And I remember that first day, everybody went for these. They go, "I've never seen those before. I want to do that." Um, and in one sense, one that's flattering, right? Because you go, "Oh wow, they like my cards." But at another sense, I think that the freshness, the novelty, um, which appealed to people, um, gave them an opportunity to have a magical and creative experience because they couldn't mentally fall back on, "Oh, I've seen that. I've seen those cards before. This is just what they mean," which locks your mind down into some preset meanings right away. And so I think when it's novel, their minds open. It's like,
Mm.
what comes next? What happens next? What happens next? And I think it opens a creative play space for real magic to happen for the person. And yeah, and that's what I think essentially divination and readings are, right? They're magical events that open our eyes to things we hadn't thought about in that particular way.
You're the only person I know. You've been carrying your bar cards around with you like
Yeah,
all the time
I
for
do.
years now and giving people tarot card readings everywhere. And I've never not seen somebody just express being completely baffled by how the cards could reflect them so clearly. They've always had very joyous. It's always been a great experience. It's always been fun to
Yeah,
watch.
I think you're right. That's been my experience about it. They've been experimenting with speed reading, right? There,
Yeah.
a magician in England approached me because I've never read cards. I want to learn how to read cards. So he got the cards, and I've been sending him little clips because he said, "Well, send me videos. Like, how do you do this?" And so, like leaving the gym the other day, I stopped at the counter and I said, "Are you interested in a little reading?" And the woman went, "Yes." And I said, "How much time do you have because you're working?" And she said, "I probably have 2 minutes." And I said, "Oh," I said, "divination happens in a flash." And so I had somebody hold the camera. We read it, and it's a minute and a half. And you can see her at the end going, "Yes, it makes perfect sense." I'm like, "Thank you. Have a nice day." And then ran out, right? Whereas, other readings might go on for 15, 20 minutes, right? When you have an extended period of time. Um, but yeah, I've been really fortunate. I think people catch up the playfulness about it is what really strikes me. And I think that's the way to have insight. I think for years, doing lots of therapy as a psychiatrist with people, um, my general observation is that if something is a challenge and you're going to have to change something in your life, it's always scary. And unless you can really either trust the person you're working with or have a sense of play, it's hard to have the courage to tackle something new. So I think um, it probably subtly influences the way I do all readings, which they're very supportive, but it's playful because it's a possibility. It's something you can explore. And I think that really encourages people to confront what they need to do if they, because if they're stuck and they want to, it's going to take strength to do it, right? To do something. And I think when you approach it with a supportive, playful idea, people have more strength to do that. Yeah, they have more courage and they feel supported. Um, yeah, for that.
So, I mean, you don't only read tarot, you also perform with it. I mean, you turned tarot into this fascinating sort of theatrical experience for
Yeah.
audiences from, I know, small groups to entire theaters, which
Yes.
I think is pretty amazing. How did you begin doing tarot shows? It's like not like anything I've actually ever seen before. I don't exactly know even how to describe what it is, except that it's delightful and that everybody in the audience sort of gets a tarot card reading, a reading of some sort by the end, and it's astounding and sort of mixes history.
Yeah.
It's a great time. But I am curious about how all that came about.
Well, serendipity. Well, it came about partially by accident, in the sense that so I was where do I start? So I was doing a show in DC, and a friend said to me, the guy who was producing the show, said, "You need 15 more minutes," and I was like, "Oh, I need 15 more minutes." And they said, "Well, look, you've been talking about tarot, you've been performing about, your grandmother. Just read cards for the audience." And so, in the show I was doing at the time, where I never did any gallery readings of the audience, we put that segment in. And I remember we were getting, after the show, comments from people leaving the theater, and my friend came to me and said, "You have to do that again tomorrow night." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, everybody said that, so it's a wonderful magic show. It's really lovely." And then there was that whole moment where, like, that was all real. That was like amazing. They were mesmerized. And so I did it again the next night, and sort of had the same impact. And even, I think, remember, a magician who was there came up after the show, because I had invited him up on stage to just like pick up one of the questions from someone in the audience, and he started fishing through them to make sure they weren't all the same question and things like that, like a magic tricky sort of thing, and was baffled about how I was reading the cards and was answering the question in his mind. And I remember he came and goes, I'm familiar with many methods. How is that done?" And between you and we were both amazed. But it was an interesting moment to say, wow, this would be, people really enjoy this, and it's not exploitative. Um, I mean, after being a therapist for like so many years, I've never been interested in using people's sad emotions or meaningful things as a way to entertain other people. And so, like, in The Woman Who Saw All show, I remember I had a moment where I asked someone to raise their hand if someone has passed who they were very close to, and if they would want to share something that made them smile, like in missing this person, and do a mini testimonial about the person. And, it requires sensitivity to do that. So I'm not using them to propel a show
Mhm.
in a way. So I've been really mindful of that. And I was a little worried about, how do you do a show where people write questions that might be extraordinarily meaningful, deep, sad, whatever. And how do you make that entertaining in a group setting? Is sort of like, group therapy is not that interesting as an entertainment spectacle, right? It might be in movies, but in my experience, running groups was challenging, fascinating, meaningful, but not theater. And so I think it did take time and effort, and it did take a lot of work to try and figure out how to how to do that as a theater experience, and
Yeah.
how to have humor sprinkled in. But I said it all came about by serendipity, because I did go to perform for a group of magicians who
Mm.
do psychic entertainment, and I'd been planning on doing something that magicians do, very magic-y things, and it didn't happen. I ended up on stage. With an audience waiting me to answer their questions with cards. And this was just like when I do individual readings. I have no knowledge of the question on their mind, no knowledge about them. And I thought, well, the magicians may never invite me back, but I'm going to treat them just like I would any individual person, and be playful and supportive, and then move things along. And it worked. I mean, it was terrifying for a few moments, and then I realized, huh, no, in a group, people's brains work the same way. And as long as I'm supportive and link, then I can, and I'm pretty spontaneous, so I can find the humanity part of it, right? And link people and say, well, we all have that. You're like, well, thank them, right? And get people supporting people. And so I can use the mood for a show to create different mood tones in a show that move from humor to slightly. Some things might be sad or reminiscent. Others are more encouraging, looking for the future, and then use some things together. Like I learned from a friend who knew a very famous performer, Kasheta, who apparently read everybody's palms, right? And I was like, I'm going to run through the crowd and read everybody's tarot card, right? So that was great inspiration, and I was always worried, would I ever do it justice? But I have a lot of fun, and people are holding up their card that they've gotten serendipitously, and they suddenly can relate to the tarot card they're hanging on to and the meaning that I interpret in a flash going by them. And so it makes a huge collective experience. And the strangest thing about a tarot show compared to a regular magic show is that at the end they don't want to leave. They stay and compare notes with everybody else. Everybody wants to show everybody else the card they got, and they get to know and talk to people. And I think that's the cool part. The cards are us, so it links people in a weird way. Whereas in a regular magic show, people want to come to you because you're the one who's created all these mystifying effects. And in a tarot show, it's the cards.
Yeah.
And the cards are the magic. I see things, and um, but people know that at core, these are these imagery. These are these images we've been playing with for hundreds of years that have a life of their own, and so it's a really different kind of a magic show that's fun. I'm
Yeah.
not tired at the end of a tarot show, right? You do a regular magic show, you're like, this is work. It was fun, but I had to worry, will this work? Will this work? Will this work? In a tarot show, it's like the focus is all on staying connected to everyone in the room,
Yeah.
so that there's no real passive spectator. We're all in it together. And I think that's what makes the show, I'd like to think that's what makes the show work. So, but people do seem to really enjoy it. And then when people come back, each show is kind of different because there's different questions in the room. So it's kind of a new experience from night to night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It I've seen a few of these shows, and I have to say they fly by. It's a delightful sort of combination of genuine insights and theatrical sort of storytelling.
Mm.
And the best part is, in various ways, you bring up one person, or several people, or the whole audience. And every time that you use the tarot to sort of tell fortunes, I guess is what you call it,
Yeah. Yeah.
is the sheer amazement and delight that people express and you could just tell that it's sort of resonating with people in the audience. It's a cool show, and I just feel bad because there's no good terms or words to sort of describe what it is. It's sort of its own kind of thing. You can sort of
Yeah.
liken it most closely to, I guess, a magic show or a mentalism show. And it's sort of almost like the shows that spirit mediums do, the ones who talk to people's dead
Yeah.
relatives in the audience without
Yeah.
sort of going there. It's kind of like all those things, but it's its own separate thing. And I love that the the knowledge and your knowledge of the history of tarot and the great stories about it that you tell too just make it it's a super super fun evening.
Oh,
I can
it's so cool.
see I can see where magicians in the audience you'd mentioned might be inspired to try to use tarot in their own shows,
Yeah.
in their own ways. I don't know. What advice would you give to magicians who are interested in incorporating tarot into their performances?
My advice, I know right away what I tell them. I told one this the other day. I said, don't turn the tarot cards into like a magic trick deck card
Mm,
trick. Um, because people already know what regular playing cards are and they understand a card magic trick, and that makes sense to them. In their mind, tarot is something very different. And it's not about fool me with something. It's like these things are supposed to tell me something about me or about the future, something that I care about. And I always tell them, I said, you need to really respect that and go with it. It's a much more amazing kind of magic. To a person when they leave the theater, they remember something about themselves way longer than they remember, oh, you know, he found the ace. All the aces hopped out of the deck. But I had someone who wanted to use like the 3 card Monty sort of thing about the queens and the ace and finding out where it is, and do it with the tarot, like where's the devil versus the lovers or the high priestess. And I said I would just do it with a regular deck because it's a really cool street hustle magic trick. It's baffling in and of itself. Why do it with cards that people associate with something completely different?
Yeah.
They associate it with like personal meaning, fortune telling, the future, and something. So if you're going to do it, and you're a magician, I would say develop a routine where it sticks to that idea, so that the audience's experience is that these are more interesting. It's a different kind of magic. It's a mystical, magical experience where something amazing happens, but it's different than what they could ever see you do with a deck of playing cards, because it moves it to a new level. And then the other element is that the cards are really about other people. You might embed the tarot into telling a story, but then again, that's different than maybe telling a story like you might with a card trick. But I would say elevate it. Don't make it redundant. Playing cards are already wonderful, and you do amazing things with them, and it's beautiful. But with the tarot, I wouldn't do card mechanic effects or anything. I would say use them to enhance the magical experience of the show you're doing that you can't do any other way
Yeah.
around that. And my advice is that the way to do that is to realize that those cards and whatever you do with them are going to be magic about those individual people, and something either they believe, they think, they feel in their own life, and they remember that far longer than where the coin went, or how did a $1 bill turn into $100 bill, or where'd the dove go, or something like that. Yeah, they appreciate it in a very different way. So I encourage magicians to consider it, and then to kind of honor that, like to view them in the way people do. I think I was reading from Ben Earl the other day, a wonderful magician in England, um, who's just written a new series. He wrote a little monograph called "What the Fuck," and or WTF, and he said too many people who are performing only think about the performance they think of in their own head, and they always forget, how is my audience thinking? What do they see? What do they feel? What do they expect? Because the magic happens in their mind. And how do I begin to really reimagine the audience's point of view in what I do? And so I think if you draw on that in pop culture and go, what are tarot? You can really do something creative and entertaining and mystifying and magical, understanding how the audience views them. But audiences view those cards very differently than they do playing cards. Yeah.
Yeah. I would find it very, if I were to watch a magician just substitute tarot cards for regular deck of cards, I think you're right. I would find it very confusing. I can look at an ace of spades and know exactly what it is and remember that card. I don't think I'd
Hmm.
have, it'd be a cognitive load for me to like interpret the tarot
Would.
card and try to remember.
Would.
It just doesn't make any sense sort of to me
Yeah.
to even try to.
Especially if you grab my cards, because they won't even know them from pop culture, right? So they go, I have no idea what I'm looking at, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's true.
yeah. So I think for magicians, they're missing out on a really neat opportunity to do different magic rather than trying to make it duplicative of what's already available. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Interesting.
my that would be my advice. Yeah.
So where are you planning to go next with your combination of art and theater here?
Oh, with respect to Tarot,
Yeah.
um, my dream now with the tarot show is to expand it in a way that it can even be more accessible to a larger crowd. Like right now, I find the way I've designed the show, I can get everybody involved if I have an audience that's a little more intimate, up to 60 people, and
Mhm.
everyone can be involved in the show. And I was sitting in the theater last night watching a musical and thinking, I have some ideas now how to expand it so you could have a much larger audience while still giving everyone the feeling that they're connected in the show to what's going on the stage. Um, in a way for readings and cards and things like that, and trying to think of, there's a couple of technical things to do so that people can visually lock in on what's going on stage, and some other ways of structuring a performance that engages people who might be in a balcony, right, versus on stage, who can't get down to the stage, but still answering questions. So kind of in the old George Anderson Q&A style, how do you get the whole audience engaged in something where it's all happening really in their mind, right? When
Mhm.
you think about it, you're holding cards, but it's the narrative, it's what you're saying, and the other person going, yes, this is what's going on, right? So it's that really neat connection with human beings in the audience. So what that's one thing I'd love to do. I'd love to do it in New York City at the town hall. uh, i
Ah,
think I think a town hall I think a town hall show, it's like an old tent revival thing, right? Would be really awesome. I would love to do that. Uh, the more immediate thing is I'm planning on it for Christmas, and then in the spring I'll be over in the UK performing in the spring uh,
nice.
with that. So yeah, and I think with respect to the cards, getting ready to do another run. The first printing series all sold out. I think I have two books left, and do another run
Okay,
of.
so the most important question, of course, is where can people get these cards?
Uh,
How do they get your book? How do they get your cards?
they can email me. They can go to my website, theseer.net, and send me a note through the Google link. It generally can work through
Okay.
PayPal and Venmo. I'm in the process right now of trying to decide whether or not to continue only to sell them privately, just because I'd like to keep the quality. There's
Mhm.
people who want plastic cards. These are not. This is a really high quality eggshell paper. They age in a really lovely way. I didn't want to put any more plastic in the environment, and so the printer that I use is Kennelly over here in West Haven, Connecticut, and I think they just do a fantastic job. And I've wanted to
Mhm.
stick to that. And yeah, they don't do the promoting of what they print. You order it, you print it, and so I think I'll
Okay.
stick to selling them for people who contact me. Um, people have some options. I sell the book and the cards separately. So if people just want the full 78, they can have that if they want that, or if they just want the book, and they can extrapolate in their brain. For the examples in the book, I use examples using my own cards, but
Mhm.
I think if somebody said, no, I want your book, I don't want your cards, but I'd like the thinking around how to read cards, they could do that with theirs. But I think the two go beautifully together for that. But that's my goal. And then I'd like to produce a series of instructional videos on reading cards. So I'm trying now to get a collection of spontaneous readings. So as I said, I'm making these 1 minute readings or longer. I'm trying to make a series of videos, and if I'm happy with the quality of the video for sound and visual stuff. I'm thinking about a way about making those available to people who have, purchased books and cards so they can actually see something in action. It makes it a little easier for people to get over that sometimes fearful hurdle of getting out there and just discovering the joy of reading cards.
Great. Well, Andy, thank you. This has been a fascinating look into how the tarot can connect art and psychology and wonder all at once. So I appreciate your talking today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure, Michael. Bye-bye.
Bye.